Hello, and welcome to Lecture 11, Part 3 from Life in the Universe. In this video, we're going to conclude this lecture and conclude Unit D by going through some of those highlights in the history of life on Earth and taking it on into the future a bit, because we actually do have a reasonably good idea about the long-term habitability of the Earth. Now, this is actually something I've added just very recently. So this particular slide is not mentioned in the lecture notes. Sorry about that. But this is what's probably the oldest good evidence for life on Earth. This is from some hydrothermal vent precipitates, or ancient ones, that were found in Quebec. And this microscopic picture with false color here, these tube structures you see here are basically largely about the mineral hematite, but based on the details of your structures and size and mineral content, they look an awful lot like ones that are produced by modern microorganisms in seafloor hydrothermal vents and in younger fossil microorganisms. But notice the age here. So somewhere between, and I'll round off a little more than what the authors of the original paper did, 3.8, 4.3 billion years. So this could potentially go back into the time of the heavy bombardment. But this is an indication that we've had life on Earth at least since 3.8 billion years ago. Now, some other very old, in some cases nearly as old, things that we have analogies of today are these things called stromatolites. So right here we have some contemporary ones in just off the coast of Australia. And these are sedimentary rocks that are built up by mats of photosynthetic bacteria. And they basically, as they grow, they put layers down, and you can see the layers in this cross section from a modern one. Well, here is a cross section from a much older one that is 3.5 billion years old, that is just pretty much just like the modern ones. So here, this is actually the actual fossilized bacteria, but rather the sediment that the bacterial mats lay down. And anyway, that was 3.5 billion years old. Here's one that's a bit older at 3.7 billion years. Again, the structure of it shows that it's looks just like the kind of things that the modern bacteria do. So indicating that 3.7, 3.8 billion years ago, by then definitely, and maybe earlier, there was in fact life on Earth. Now, individual microbes, because they're really small and soft and squishy, they don't fossilize easily, but they occasionally do. And here's an example of what may be looks like a string of several prokaryotic cells, if that is indeed fossilized, if that is indeed what they are. All right, now, so somewhere down here in the 3.7 billion year, maybe up back to about 4.3, we get life originating. And the earliest organisms would have been definitely prokaryotes. The more complex eukaryotic cells came along some later, based on the genetic evidence. How different genetically are eukaryotes from prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea? That gives us probably around 2.9 billion years ago is when the line that led to eukaryotes diverged from the prokaryotes. But these eukaryote ancestors still would have been prokaryotes at that time. It probably would have taken a while before a cell as complex as a eukaryote developed. The oldest eukaryotic fossils are, as it sees, a bit younger, around 2.1 billion years ago, which is, where are we? Yeah, right about there. So somewhere around here is the divergence between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, but it's not till here that we get the first eukaryotic fossils. Now, eukaryotes seem to have evolved from symbiotic groups of prokaryotic cells, whether it was an actual symbiotic relationship initially, maybe some one cell parasitizing another that developed into a more symbiotic relationship, or maybe the bigger cell eating the smaller one, and but then some of the smaller ones survived and managed to procreate within the larger cells. In any event, the ancestor to eukaryotes was probably a prokaryote, a pretty big one, with its genetic material, like all prokaryotes, kind of floating free. But probably the nucleus and other organelles in the eukaryotes developed first from wrinkling inwards of the cell membrane that then ultimately make their own internal membrane enclosing the DNA. So that's where the nucleus probably came from. And presumably very soon after that is when, whether it happened as straight up symbiosis or parasitism that developed into symbiosis or unsuccessful eating that ended up into symbiosis, mitochondria had to move into the eukaryotes very early in the lineage, because essentially all eukaryotes have mitochondria today. The few that don't, you see remnants of them, so indicating they had, their ancestors had mitochondria, but they've lost them. But it was only sometime after animals and fungi diverged from the lineage that would become plants that chloroplast moved in, because otherwise we'd all have chloroplast. And you go try and sit out in the sun and try and photosynthesize, it's not going to work very well for you. All right, but anyway, around the time eukaryotes started coming along, this is when we finally start to get a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. And you might remember from high school biology that oxygen is produced by photosynthesis, and that's where it comes from. And the thing is, the O2 molecule is highly reactive, and it can be destructive of a lot of biologically molecules. So first, you go along with photosynthesis for a while. You don't get a buildup in oxygen because oxygen is oxidizing all the surface rocks. Basically, the crust rusts. And then after that happens, and the crust can't take up any more oxygen, then it can start building up in the atmosphere. And that probably actually killed off a lot of the microbes at that time in the so-called great oxygenation event, because they wouldn't be able to survive in a high oxygen environment. But seems like it's probably the ancestors of the mitochondria that did this, found a way to actually use oxygen in metabolism. And so for that reason, oxygen is actually vital for many organisms today. But do not think that oxygen is a necessity for life. It is not. Even though some individual types of organisms use it, oxygen is not a general necessity for life. If anything, it's the other way around. You need life to produce oxygen to maintain high levels of it in the atmosphere. Also important is the ozone molecule, which has 3 oxygen atoms instead of 2. And this is important because a layer of it in the upper atmosphere keeps ultraviolet radiation from the sun to a large extent from making it to the surface. Before enough ozone built up in the atmosphere, that ultraviolet light would have made life out of the oceans impossible, or if not impossible, nearly so, because it's really hard. And so we need oxygen for eukaryotes to survive, and we need ozone to get out of the oceans and get onto the land. Okay, so anyway, where are we? Okay, eukaryotes and oxygen come in here. Multi-celled organisms, as you can see, are a fairly late development, roughly 1.5 billion years ago. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Note that animals diverge from fungi somewhere around 0.9 billion years ago, less than 1 billion years ago. And life on land, first plants, microbes, and fungi, amphibians came later, and actually after insects and other arthropods, but only about 500 million years. About 10% of the overall history of life on Earth has there been any life on land. Now, multi-celled life comes in late. What does that mean? Well, the fact it came late may mean that complex multi-celled life may be a relatively rare event. because it took the Earth so long to get to it. On the other hand, um, this is just kind of a general eukaryotic divergence. Uh, Complex multicelled life has evolved independently for animals, twice for fungi. Green algae here, embryophytes, that would include modern plants, related but evolved separately in red algae, and then in this group, other group called brown algae. So we have at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times that multicellular life has evolved independently on Earth. And that's encouraging if you like the idea of there being lots of complex multicelled organisms, because this might just be telling us that the late occurrence of it means that you've got to get to a certain level of complexity in your cells before you can have multicelled life. But once you get it, you're likely to get it, and even likely to get it multiple times. Now, there's evidence that the Earth has had several what we call snowball Earth episodes, during which much, if not all, of the Earth's surface was covered with ice. And when this happens, this is likely to be a mass extinction event because, well, you freeze over the whole Earth, you're probably going to kill a lot of what was already there. But when it ends, it then opens up a lot of opportunities for survivors. And interestingly, these episodes seem to have ended around the time that eukaryotes originated, and also around the time the animals originated. So um, um, even though it might not be good for one of these things to hit, if you're around, and if you might be good for your descendants, if at least descendants of those who survive it. Now, in terms of intelligence and technology, we're actually going to see later on, we're going to have a very strict definition of a civilization for operational purposes, such that we have been in that stage for about 100 years, basically involving having capacity to communicate across interstellar distances by radio. But if you want to maybe just consider something about around the time you get to some kind of reasonable tool use, then that's relatively recent. So this shows basically our ancestry and some of our close relatives. So it's only been maybe the last 6-7 million years since our ancestors diverged from the ancestors of chimpanzees and gorillas. Our own genus of Homo separated probably from Australopithecines a couple of million years ago, which is why I came up with that, although Australopithecines seem to have made some tools as well. And then modern humans, Homo sapiens, are quite recent, on this scale even getting to something more modern than modern Homo sapiens would hardly show up here. So very, very recent development. And then so if you want to maybe think about what what the Earth's history might be telling us about how things in general might proceed on a planet with life. This is when you get these various things happening as a percentage of the age of the Earth, how long ago it was. And first I'd say that if the history of life on Earth tells us anything in general, it's in this step right here. The fact that you had life on Earth, even if just simple microbes like bacteria and archaea, so early on the history of Earth, basically as soon as it could be here, if it tells us anything, that at least getting microbes like bacteria and archaea probably isn't too terribly hard. If there's any, like I said, if there's any one lesson that we can plausibly draw from the history of life on Earth, it's that. However, with everything else coming along significantly later in the history of life on Earth, we have to certainly raise the question that the further down here we go and the more recent these developments are, might mean that in general, these are progressively less likely occurrences. Now, I want to conclude this unit by thinking a little bit about the far future of life on Earth. And the first one of these is to something that's going to happen in the next about a half a billion to a billion years from now. Over geological time, atmospheric CO2 levels are dropping. And the blip in the increase of CO2 that we are currently doing by burning fossil fuels, even if we burn all the fossil fuels the Earth has, that is going to be over the. I mean, that's a problem over the time scale of decades to centuries to maybe even a few millennia. That is an inconsequential blip on this long-term geological scale, even though it matters a hell of a lot for us now and for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It, it doesn't matter on the scale of half a billion years. The reason why CO2 is slowly decreasing is because right now it's kind of cycled between the Earth's crust and atmosphere. And but what causes it to be released from the crust is geological activity, largely volcanism. But as the Earth ages, we'll talk about this in our planet surface geology unit, internal heat decreases, that volcanic and tectonic activity lessens, and so when it's removed from the atmosphere, it doesn't get back as quickly. And it'll take in about half a billion to a billion years. The CO2 level will drop below about 10 parts per million. Right now, it's somewhere around 400 parts per million. Pre-industrial revolution was in kind of the mid 200 parts per million. But anyway, all photosynthesis that we have going on today, all varieties of it, needs at least 10 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere to work. So unless some other more efficient form of photosynthesis can evolve in that time, and maybe it can, but still going to need some CO2. So sometime around this way, you cut off CO2. Okay, once CO2 is, you cut off photosynthesis. Once photosynthesis ends, you're no longer adding oxygen to the atmosphere. So the oxygen in the atmosphere will very quickly on geologic timescales oxidize out of it. And by quickly, this may be measured in timescale of thousands of years. Right now, the level of oxygen in the atmosphere is about 21% of the atmosphere. So without photosynthesis, it drops pretty quickly down to about 1%. Right there, you lose life on land because you no longer have an ozone layer to shield you from, because you need the O2 to make the O3. You don't have the ozone layer to shield the land from solar ultraviolet radiation. There'll be more of it at that time because the sun will be brighter and hotter for reasons we'll get into that as well. And so there's no more life on land, and most, if not all, multicelled organisms, and in fact, most microbes need O2, so you lose them as well. So basically, anaerobic bacteria and archaea are what can survive this for the most part. Now, like I said, the sun's luminosity is gradually increasing. It's getting brighter. And in about 1 to 2 billion years, it'll get to the point where the oceans will boil. And one of two things can happen here. The temperature of the Earth might not spike much if the water vapor is quickly lost to space. If it's not, then we'll get a very thick atmosphere of water vapor, much thicker than the atmosphere we have now. And water vapor is a very strong greenhouse effect gas, so you'll get a runaway greenhouse conditions like we have on Venus. We'll talk about this when we get to the unit on planetary atmospheres. So what could potentially survive this? Well, before the oceans boil, you could have anaerobic microbes surviving in the oceans, but now there are no oceans. So maybe some anaerobic prokaryotes deep in the crust, kilometers deep, might be able to survive until the sun's main sequence phase of its life is over. And when we get to the stellar evolution unit, we'll talk about that. But then when the sun leaves the main sequence and becomes a red giant, it might actually grow to the point where it swallows the Earth, in which case definitely nothing's left alive. And even if it doesn't, only something that could live in a magma ocean could survive that phase. And that will happen in about 5 to 6 billion years. So right now, I've extended this thing into the future. So we're here somewhere in this neighborhood is when the photosynthesis stops, the atmosphere deoxygenizes. So we'll probably lose most of the eukaryotes then. So protists, plants, fungi, animals are kind of gone then. Decrease in bacteria and probably some archaea, but they could possibly they could hang on. So let's see here. Also somewhere in this area, somewhere there is where we get the oxidation. Somewhere in there is where up to about 2 billion years from now, this is where the oceans boil. Probably some bacteria and archaea would survive, but then up here is when the sun leaves the main sequence, and that's it. But if you think about it, if you start eukaryotes maybe somewhere around here, everything before here belongs to prokaryotes, bacteria and archaea. All the future from here up belongs to bacteria and archaea. So most of the history is theirs, and most of the future is theirs as well. I think probably the good news is if we are around at any time at all, or our distant descendants, which probably won't resemble humans very much, are still around in 500 million years, they'll hopefully have the ability to go somewhere else. All right, now my attendance secret code for this lecture. This is a still from a movie directed by Terrence Malick called The Tree of Life from year 2011, which is a very interesting movie. It kind of follows his family and one particular member of it from the 50s to maybe modern day, but in a very non-linear fashion, jumping around. Most of the scenes are maybe only a few seconds long, so you're going to get impressions of what's going on. Beautifully shot, but also interspersed with it some kind of visions of the Earth's distant past and distant future, and this is what it's from. I think it's a movie that probably the whole of it is not equal to the sum of the parts, that all the individual scenes are really beautiful, but it takes some, I'm not sure it adds up to, what its potential could be. But this is a scene from it showing the Earth right here in the far future, and all this other stuff you see is the surface of the sun as a red giant as it is expanding towards the Earth. And apparently it took a lot of care to try and accurately represent convection in the sun's and the red giant's atmosphere here. So it's probably pretty accurately what it really would look like. And actually most of the special effects, as beautiful as they are, were done with minimum of CGI, done by other techniques. So anyway, film director Terrence Malick is our attendance secret code. And it's an interesting movie, which I guess that's what I'll say about it. I think I like it, but I'm not entirely sure. Okay, so that is the end of lecture 11 and of unit D. With lecture 12, we will start unit E, which will be some of the things about energy, matter, and light that we probably should know a bit about to make sense of some of the things that we'll get into later. So I will anyway let you know when those videos are available. And until then.